we get to the housekeeping parts, I just want to welcome everyone to today's talk, Defying Backlash, Feminist Leadership and Change in a Tumultuous Era. The talk is going to be given by Professor Charlotte Bunch, and I'm going to go through the run of the day, and then we will do the formal introductions. So I'm very pleased to have so many people attend this very important and inspiring, what's promising to be an inspiring talk. My name is Brinda Narayan. I'm a professor of constitutional law at McGill University and a member of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. I'm also a member of the board of directors of Bloom. We're going to start with, pass the floor to Homa in a minute, and Homa will give a brief introduction of Bloom. This lecture today is co-sponsored by Bloom, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, and its Leadership Institute, Transformative Feminist Leadership Institute, and Women's Learning Partnership. So we will have an introduction from our co-hosts and our collaborators, also co-hosted by McGill University's Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. So Homa will provide a brief introduction, and then we'll hear from the co-organizers and also about future collaboration. And then I will get back to you to formally introduce Charlotte Bunch. We'll have the lecture for about 30-35 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to discussions and question and answer for about 35 to 40 minutes. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we start with the rest of the program. Could I please request you to make sure that you're muted? If possible, it would be nice to see your faces, just so that, the speaker knows who's listening, what they're thinking, etc. And if you have any questions, please send them to me in the chat. We'll have a moderated Q&A at the end of Charlotte's talk. And if you could type your questions into the chat, and then I'll keep the speakers list. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Homa. Thank you, Homa Jan. It's yours.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. But thank you very much for attending, and thanks to Charlotte for actually accepting our invitation. I've given 2 minutes to quickly say a word about Bloom. Women Living Under Muslim Laws was set up in 1984, trying to connect women across the Muslim context, where, of course, fundamentalism had got a new life, especially after Iranian Revolution. Our mission was to connect women across the border to learn from one another and to support each other, and also be connected to the global feminist movement. At the time, of course, there weren't that many independent women's organizations in the Muslim context. So it was for us to actually work together to try to create that solidarity. It was in 1985 we joined the international NGOs coalition to work against eradication on violence against women, and also mobilize for women gender equality. And later, of course, the slogan became, but Charlotte will talk more about it, women's rights are human rights. It was in that context that Charlotte and with colleagues set up the Center for Global Leadership of Women. So we at Bloom, of course, we realized that leadership is very context specific. So we joined the center, and Anissa Harry dropped her PhD, joined the center to develop the program and the pedagogy and the training system. So that's then in 1998, for the first time, we launched the institute in Istanbul. And then the following year, it was in Nigeria, Lagos in Nigeria. And since then, we have had many leadership institutes in varieties of countries. Originally, this was planned to talk with to bring seasoned feminists together, to connect them, to be able to work nationally and globally. But in the process, we realized a lot of young women, young aspiring women also want to join and be part of the institute. So we, as a part of our intergenerational program, by which I mean connecting with young people, transmitting our experiences to them while we learn of the new strategies, the initiative they have. So it will be give and take. So we redesigned this program to be also to accommodate the needs of younger feminists. So now it is designed at 3 levels, at the level for the national level and regional level and international level. So we hope to work on that. Now I leave the floor really to Mona, who has been working on developing the module and the program for the first level, national level, starting this year, to give you a little bit more detail about how this is going on and also the new initiative that they have in mind. Monajan, back to you.
Hi. Greetings, everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. It's a great pleasure to be among all of you, to meet you in this virtual space. And as well, I'm extremely grateful to Charlotte for accepting our invitation to discuss a really important topic. So yes, as Homa mentioned, my name is Mona Tajali. I'm an executive board member of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network, which for short, we call it WALUM. Over the past 4 decades, WALUM has been able to foster important partnerships with other women's rights advocacy groups, including many who work locally across various Muslim majority contexts. This event has been co-organized with a selection of our partners, and we're very grateful for all of their support and publicizing efforts. They include Women's Learning Partnership, Women's Platform for Equality, Turkey, or also referred to as ESHIC, Women and Children Research and Advocacy Network, which is active in Afghanistan, Turkish Association for Supporting Women Candidates, or KADAR, and Noor, a global feminist and movement-driven think and do tank that was founded just a couple of years ago. Please see in the chat a brief introduction of each of the organizations alongside their websites. I highly encourage you all to learn more about these entities and as well as engage with their important work. We're also very thankful to our council members, Myra Asif, and many volunteers and interns who supported the making of this event a reality, including Alejandro Fierro Castro, who's with us, and Hafsa Girdap, and many others. So WALUM's rich history as a feminist solidarity network across the Muslim majority world, as well as its past experiences of training and supporting feminist activists, positions it well to continue its efforts in feminist leadership, as Homa just briefly emphasized. We would like to also take this occasion to announce more details about the relaunch of our Feminist Leadership Institute, as well as how it will grow in partnership with Women's Learning Partnership. Our revived initiative, which we call it the Transformative Feminist Leadership Institute, builds on WALUM's former Feminism in the Muslim World Leadership Institutes that were in operation from 1998 to 2014, that Charlotte Bunch also contributed to. The Institute will offer tailored trainings to nourish the newer generations of feminists in their local context, drawing from resources and support of Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network. This project aims to facilitate exchange of experiences and knowledge across borders centered on gender justice and gender equality. Given the recent extensive backlash against women's rights in Afghanistan and Iran, the pilot phase of this project is focused on capacity building of young aspiring leaders in these 2 contexts and building bridges of their experiences, resources by transnational feminist networks, and various forms of nonviolent resistance. We're also really excited to see this relaunch grow in partnership with Women's Learning Partnership, as my colleague Leila Austin will also explain.
Thank you, Mona Jan, and greetings to all. As Mona mentioned, I'm Leila Austin, and along with my colleague Alison Horowski, I'm co-executive director of Women's Learning Partnership, a partnership of 20 women's rights organizations across the Global South, working to leverage the collective power of connected feminist leaders and organizations to build and sustain gender justice movements. For 25 years, our partnership has been doing this work through co-created and contextually adapted learning resources and advocacy campaigns to ensure maximum impact for local activists while advancing gender justice globally. And I'm happy to mention that we use the writings and wisdom of our guest of honor, Charlotte Bunch, in our leadership training. We're proud and honored to be collaborating with Volum and its Transformative Feminist Leadership Institute to share resources and accelerate innovative methodologies to support and empower the many young change makers who are courageously taking action to demand accountability, democracy, and a just future for all. Together, we're joining forces in our efforts to building resilient cross-border movements and campaigns in support of gender justice and equality. As part of this pilot program, which we are currently calling Cross-Border Coalitions for Gender Justice, we will be working with youth activists living in country and in the diaspora, creating important spaces for exchange, support, and mentorship on sustained gender egalitarian movement building.
Verinda John, you're muted.
Thanks, Mona. So thank you so much, Leila. Thank you, Mona. I'm just going to go to the next part of our program, and I would like to formally introduce Charlotte Bunch to the audience. Charlotte Bunch is Distinguished Professor Emerita in Women's and Gender Studies, Rutgers University. She was the founder and executive director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. She has been an activist in feminist, LGBTQ+, and other human rights movements for over 50 years. She's the leader of the global campaign for recognition of women's rights as human rights, as well as other international feminist initiatives. Charlotte's transformative work has significantly shaped the global feminist and women's rights movement. Her lifelong commitment to gender equality and integrating women's rights into the broader human rights agenda has notably influenced the United Nations approach to gender issues. A pivotal moment in Charlotte's career was her central role in organizing the Beijing NGO Forum during the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995. Charlotte highlights the need to connect women's movements globally to utilize the international human rights system for empowering local women's groups. She expresses the need for older feminists to support and understand the activism of younger generations and discusses the importance of both men and women to embrace feminism. She has long worked to bring women, gender-based violence, and sexual rights onto national and global agendas. Her contributions to conceptualizing and organizing for women's rights and human rights have been recognized by many, including the National Women's Hall of Fame, the White House Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, the 1,000 Women Peacemakers nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Before her work at the Global Center, Charlotte was a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and a founder of DC Women's Liberation and of Quest, a feminist quarterly. She's written numerous articles and edited or co-edited 9 anthologies, including the Center's report on the UN Beijing +5 review processes in 2000 and the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. She's published a volume of her own collected work, Passionate Politics, Feminist Theory in Action, among other significant achievements. So if I had to read all of Charlotte's bio, it would take the entire morning. So I'm going to leave it at that. And please join me in welcoming Charlotte.
Verinda, can I say a word?
Please. Oh, Homer, yes, please.
I wanted to say that when we started to work with Charlotte, and there was a lot of talk about UN and working with women's rights or human rights, me and many others, we weren't really trusted anything about working with the UN. I couldn't see how UN has any impact in our undemocratic context. But I said, okay, I can participate in the whole thing as a scholar observer. If it worked, that's all the best. If it didn't work, then I write about why it didn't work. But as it happened, it worked. And it wasn't only me, many of us who worked in especially Muslim context didn't really see the relationship between UN and our struggle locally. But since then, things have changed, and I can see completely the connection between global and locally. The more, in fact, in more undemocratic contexts, we need a super state situation that legitimizes our demand and connection. So I wanted to say thank you to Charlotte for changing up not just my mind, but many of us. And we have worked in this struggle together. Thanks to you. Thank you. That was my little 2 cents.
Okay, thank you so much, Homa and Verinda, for such a fabulous introduction, and always to remind us when we talk about the global, it's just another stage of the local work, because what is the UN but all of our governments coming together, and that gives us one more platform for trying to demand what we want, when sometimes a few governments are a little bit better than others, and that gives us a space to work them against each other. So thank you so much, Homa, for that. It's really a pleasure to be here. I value so much what I've learned from women living under Muslim laws, and I began working with Marie-May Heli-Lucas in 1990, a few years after Bloom was founded, and really, I feel it has been one of the most collaborative and mutual engagement learning processes. It has given me an ability to understand cultures that have been set up in clashes with each other, and how we as feminists, as women working together, can indeed link our struggles for change, while all the media and our governments seek to separate us and to actually pit us against each other. And so it's really been a relationship that I valued so much, and particularly the leadership institutes that you mentioned, Homa, that we did in Istanbul and Lagos were amazing experiences for me, and also work I've done with Women's Learning Partnership, also valuable ways for us to break down the barriers that the patriarchy has set up for us, whether collaborating on educational materials on human rights, films, women's rights as human rights caucuses at other places like the World Social Forum. And in particular, I think the collaboration with Bloom on the support of younger women. I think one of the key things that I have felt enabled me is when I was a young activist, I had mentors and opportunities for learning about not just women, but men social change activists around the world. And that shaped my politics. I went to North Vietnam as an anti-war activist, and they really taught me to make a distinction between people and government. We were received as the anti-war movement, as their allies. We were not treated as just being citizens of the country that was seeking to destroy them. They made a distinction that I have kept in my heart ever since, as learning that we have to distinguish between the activists and the citizens who are trying to make change and the governments that are often dominating our lives. So there's so many learning things that I have had with Loom and the Leadership Institute. It's really wonderful to be here, and I see so many faces of friends that I know out there in on the screen, as I say, that it's really I don't dare call out your names because I would miss somebody, but really your smiling faces and your nods are very encouraging to me, because I'm a digital immigrant. I don't take it easily to speak on Zoom. I only had to learn because I had to teach a class during the pandemic. So I finally learned how to at least see your faces and your expressions and those wonderful hearts some of you have just sent as a way to communicate. But it didn't come naturally. And I think that's also what we learned from younger women who know how to use these technologies and can teach us how to evolve with the world's changes. It's never us teaching them. It's always both of us learning from each other. I've been in very few situations where I was leading leadership institutes or working with people as a teacher where I wasn't learning as much as the people I was teaching. It's a two-way street, and that's what keeps it alive and moving. And I hope we'll have time at the end for some of that conversation with you. Some of you will recognize things I've said before, and I hope they're still relevant. And with that, I would like to unpack a little bit the big words in this title about backlash and feminist transformational leadership, and talk in particular about both backlash and strategies for defending our activism in the face of it. So I start with really the most important point to always remember in defying backlash. Backlash always comes when we have made advances. Backlash is the response of the powers who have been threatened by feminism, by other social activists, and who on both an individual and an institutional level want to push us back. That would never happen if we were not moving forward. And I say this because kind of each time we face backlash, and I can remember the first time I understood backlash in the United States was at the end of the 70s, when we thought from the 60s and 70s that we had totally transformed our country. And, you know, we didn't think we were ever going to see some of the old ideas. And then all of a sudden, at the National Women's Conference in Houston in 1977, all of these right-wing women came forward, Phyllis Schlafly and all the rest, to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, to oppose lesbian rights, to oppose abortion. And they did not win. We won that showdown, but they won the big one in 1980 when they made Reagan president. And it was women as well as men. And I think that was really the hard thing for us to take. It was often even women who were, in a sense, benefiting from the feminist changes we had made in the world, who were actually part of that backlash. And it was women who were afraid of change and did not want a different role than the role they had, where they had at least some, thought they had some security. But we all know, after working on violence against women, that that security that the patriarchy provides is very thin and can be broken in multiple ways, that actually women are not secure, but nonetheless, it is very frightening often for women to try to imagine living a feminist life without more support, because patriarchy, as much as it destroys women, it does provide them with a place in the world. And for some, that place is all they have. So we have to think about how we deal with these questions, and how the backlash comes because it is actually making changes in the institutions of patriarchy, but also in people's individual lives. And sometimes those changes are welcomed, and we certainly know many things I will talk about that have shifted power, but sometimes those changes are too threatening to women as well as men. And that's where I think the backlash that we deal with today comes from. In fact, if I remember right, women living under Muslim laws formed in response to the backlash of the 1980s. As you mentioned, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in other countries where women had been pushed back from the advances they had made, and gradually, specifically in context of Muslim laws, but also connecting with the rest of us as we were facing backlash in our countries. The use of the word tumultuous time made me think about the 1980s, which in many ways were a tumultuous time for many of us, in the sense that not only Reagan, but many other, Iran, many other countries were experiencing this kind of a backlash, but also the clash of civilizations that so-called clash of civilizations that came at the end of the past century in 2000, 2001, with the 9/11 incident in the US, and in particular, the reaction of the US when it took on its wars. We've seen these tumultuous times of aggression and war. And we've also seen a crisis in the past 20 years, a crisis of governance, a crisis of our multilateral institutions, both the specific crisis of who is making the rules and the challenges of multinational corporations often being more powerful than governments, the challenges for those of us who even have electoral systems of how to control when money is actually calling the shots so often, and the challenges of the powers that are bigger than governments. And that is why I think being present in the UN is also important, because in some way, ironically, as much as governments are also often holding us back, they are sometimes the only check we have on powers of corporate power and other power that are bigger than governments. And so we've had to adapt tools. Tools like human rights have become one of the means by which women could support the feminists and the activists and the changes we were seeking. And I believe today the backlash against human rights is in many ways a backlash against how feminists and other progressive forces have broadened human rights. That when human rights was seen as a narrow space of civil and just of speech and of maybe torture, and was seen mostly from the point of view of men's lives, it was not nearly as threatening as it has become as women have utilized that space, as Indigenous people, as racial minorities, groups have understood human rights as a tool for challenging our governments and the powers like corporations and religious institutions. It has become actually, I think, one of the reasons why we see not only backlash against women's rights, but against human rights in particular. And again, an example from the US during the previous Trump administration, they tried to roll back the national definition of human rights. And I think this is the kind of backlash against what we have done for so long in many parts of the world. But to be really clear about that, what are some of those advances? I mean, I know as a lesbian feminist woman who lives in a world that is utterly impossible to have imagined when I was a child in the 1950s. I could not be living the life I live today if it hadn't been for the feminist movement opening space for us to express our individuality, our right to control our bodies, and ultimately the social space that feminism exists in. So I know personally, but I also see it. Many, many women still experience violence against women. It's a very important issue, but many women have access to ways to get out of that they did not have 50 years ago. If you look at it from a 50-year perspective, the lives of my mother and some of your grandmothers were utterly constrained. And then there were moments of advance, and the moments of advance created, again, backlash. But we have, and we still have, many of those institutional frameworks, particularly at the global level, that we can call upon, and we have to make them stronger. We have to use them more effectively, and we have to create new ones. And I will speak in a few minutes about some of the new women's human rights defender strategies that have emerged in the last decade or so that I think are so important to the protection of feminist activists and the protection of our ability to operate in the world. We have instruments defining the need for the elimination of violence against women, which wasn't even mentioned in the 1979 Convention on the Rights of Women. Now, just imagine that. the UN put together over the 70s a convention on the rights of women, CEDAW, as we call it, that was supposed to cover the breadth of the problems that women have in the world. And it is very progressive. It has economic and social rights, questions of survival, as well as political and civil rights. But there is no mention in the original convention of the problem of violence against women. Just think what it was like in 1979, 80, when that convention was passed by the UN and governments were asked to ratify, that they didn't even see the issue of violence against women. And I know many of you on this call have worked on that issue, and the fact that it is now considered probably the most important issue that the CEDAW committee looks at in assessing what governments are doing or not doing more often to support the right of women to live free of violence, or the right of women simply to be alive, because we know femicide is a very real thing in terms of the numbers of women. And there's now been launched a campaign to keep track of the numbers of women who die because of violence against women, not to speak of the numbers of women whose lives are maimed. Did that end violence? No, but it gave us tools to work more effectively for that and to make that demand. Those are advances that we have made that have challenged governments and institutions who could assume, even in 1980, when CEDAW was adopted, could assume that violence was just either a personal, a family, or a natural order of things. And I could look at, we did once a collection of all the countries and cultures who had sayings about violence against women. And, even in the UK, with the idea of not battering a woman with anything thicker than, what's the expression, than a stick. Everywhere, north, south, east, west, all our cultures had ways of justifying violence against women, and still do in many cases, but those have been challenged. I think when we started to raise the issue of violence at the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights and in Beijing, et cetera, to the global level, I don't think governments imagined what women would actually start demanding as a part of that. And I think, again, to go back to the backlash, the individual's backlash is often a direct backlash against the right of women to control their bodies. And violence and reproductive rights are, of course, at the core of that. That was unimaginable to people. I think they didn't even, they said, of course, violence is a bad thing. Did they really believe it? We don't know. But they couldn't imagine that women would actually change the world or seek to change the world in terms of those accepted violations of our lives, nor could they imagine the Security Council would talk about women, peace, and security. Now, I have a problem with some of the 1325 women, peace, and security, because it kind of assumes that you could protect women and still have war. And I don't think you can protect women if you have war. And so I think there's a little bit of a contradiction, but I have come to see that that contradiction can actually be a feminist tool for talking about the interconnectedness of issues of violence in our daily lives with the issues of militarism, war, and, quotes, national security, as the excuse is often, because you can't really make war safe for women. You can't make war safe for anyone. But if we have the Security Council of the UN saying that women shouldn't be raped in war, and that at least starts to open the space for talking about what are the contradictions of our world, that we can have this on the one hand, and then we can have the wars, the many wars that are raging now that can destroy in Gaza, hopefully not completely in Lebanon, Lena, that can destroy people's lives and think that that does not destroy women's lives also. So those separations it's important. It hasn't yet reached the point we want of protecting everyone, but those instruments help us expose the hypocrisy of thinking we can separate these issues and have women protected in war. I could give many more examples, but sexual rights is incorporating sexual rights into UN documents. That was the big breakthrough in Beijing in 1995. Do we have even a beginning of thinking that sexual rights are human rights as a part of women's rights are human rights was perhaps the biggest controversy, and actually has been the sexual rights, reproductive rights is always the sort of key point, the kind of touchstone on which the individual governments challenge the women's rights as human rights agenda and challenge our right to do these things. There are many more advances that I would like to say, things that we should not take for granted in terms of women being more present in the public sphere. Mexico had a gender parity law and now has a woman president. Would never have had a woman president probably without the gender parity law, and a culture that we all labeled very macho, that they even described proudly as macho by many men. And yet that's one of the countries that has advanced through the gender equity, through the gender parity, the kinds of changes that feminism has sought. So I think that in the midst of this backlash, we need to remember all the kinds of ways in which we've had an impact and how to defend and keep those agendas moving. One of my fears in this time of real backlash is that we only defend as if we always had this. And I think we have to understand that we are defending because we are moving forward. And so we not only defend, but we need to keep on the agenda that we need to do more, that we want to see more. And that's particularly important for younger women who may not remember all this history I'm talking about how we got here, and who may be focused on what they still think needs to happen. So I want to put together this challenge. I sometimes say women touched a nerve, and that's why we have what we have today in terms of patriarchy, backlash, and the so-called culture wars, or the wars on women in many parts of the world. What is our challenge? One of them, which I've learned so much from women living under Muslim laws, is around the question of culture itself. I remember the campaign that WLUML did around violence is not our culture. I think that was so important because violence is present in all our cultures, but saying that as women living under Muslim laws broke open the assumption that the way men had defined that culture was what women accepted. And women do not accept that violence is our culture anywhere. And yet we are told over and over again in many cultures that violence is part of our culture and culture should be protected. So to begin to understand that everywhere, not only women's rights, but human rights challenges culture. Human rights challenged culture when it first began talking about the question of torture or the question of the death penalty. These are torture issues, and these are very real issues still in the world today. The gun culture in the United States, as Yakin, I believe was even here, pointed once to how the US gun culture affects violence against women. All of these issues of culture are everywhere. They are not in one region. They are not just tradition. We have many contemporary forms of violence against women. I think particularly of the cyber violence that women are experiencing today. Each new issue, violence in the media, the ways in which violent pornographic violence, that has been, violence is contemporary as well as traditional. And any forms of justifying it in the name either of tradition or of free expression has to be questioned. Because why is violence an accepted free expression? That's the challenge we have in the Western world. I'm a big believer in human rights, but I don't believe in the human right to violate people. I don't believe in the human right to do violence or to portray violence as acceptable or to think it is that way. So how do we change even the concepts that are being used to challenge us? I remember in my own life, my first recognition that culture was a suspicious excuse came from being a part of the civil rights, Black civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. And I was just a student. I was out there, as all of us began, as one of the troops on the ground. And I was being told by white Southerners in the Methodist Church, where I was affiliated, that racial segregation was a crucial part of the culture of the South that outsiders just didn't understand. Now, how many of us have heard these arguments in other forms over and over again to justify violations of race, violations of gender, violations of sexuality? Culture is a cover-up by religious groups, by regional groups, by all kinds of people for violation. It's not apolitical. It's not unconnected to the larger patriarchal project. I think it was Pregs Govinder. Some of you remember her she's a South African feminist who arose out of the African National Congress and that struggle. And she once wrote that in South Africa, and then she said globally, the one truly non-racial institution is patriarchy. Patriarchy is a globally shared culture that expresses itself differently in local context. And she was talking about it in South Africa. We can talk about it in the US. You can talk about it in Afghanistan, where the world has allowed the reassertion of a so-called culture and religious practice that demeans women. We could talk about it in many different parts of the world, but it is being used for abuse of power and control over women. And we have to keep joining together to understand that is still happening everywhere. There are good practices we can talk about where women challenge that, but there is no culture where violence has been eliminated. And I think taking a so-called model of the past of Sweden, Amnesty International did a report about 8 or 10 years ago showing how much domestic violence there was in Sweden, a country that we thought had gender equity. And of course, today we've seen a right-wing movement rising in Sweden. So we know if there can be backlash in Sweden, there can be backlash anywhere. And so it is not a phenomena of one culture or one state or one religion. It is a phenomena of control of women, control of where women will move in the world, of our bodies, of reproduction, sexuality, etc. I don't know that I needed to say all of that because the faces I see are all people who know that. But I think it's part of what we need to convey when we are doing our leadership training, because my students were not born before 2001. My students today don't know this history, and they don't even know where the things that we have gained came from, and that they came from women's movements. The issue of violence against women is symbolic because it was never on the UN agenda until women put it there. And so I think it shows most clearly, but we could talk about many other issues that also show the influence of women activists pursuing human rights and understanding that culture is always a part of that change that has to happen. I see that my time is almost up and I didn't even get to the specifics I wanted to say about leadership. So what does all this mean about women's leadership? First of all, I was quoted by Farida as saying, leadership is making something happen or making a change in the world, including how something is viewed or the ways in which it is done. I said that at the first Leadership Institute with women living under Muslim laws because people were, as many feminists have, rejecting the term leadership. And we need to be very clear that we need leadership. We need people who are making something happen. And women have always been making something happen. They've been making budgets that kept families together. They've been, after every war and conflict, it's women who are doing most of the cleanup, but women were not recognized as leaders in doing that. And that was not legitimized. And the ways women did that were not always, but often were different than the traditional male image of leadership. We were right to challenge an image of male leadership, which said that it was a dominant patriarchal image of a leader who was separate, better, and could dominate us. Trump is a really great example of that today, as are many other leaders in the world, in India, in Turkey, in Hungary. I could go on, but you know the countries, you know what I mean. And we were right to challenge that. I think we were right to be suspicious at first about what was leadership. But the point is that we had to redefine leadership from a feminist transformational perspective to understand that we didn't want to throw out the process of making change and doing it together just because men had defined it. After all, it had been defined in at least 2,000 years of patriarchy. There are a few, perhaps, matriarchal precedents, but I prefer to depend on what we can create than to depend on a 3,000-year-old possibility that we can imagine. And so we've had to distinguish it. And I think we've come to the term of transformational leadership as a way of talking about feminist leadership. I call it feminist leadership. And if it's not transformational, in my view, it's not feminist. But since feminism is often a term people have difficulty defining, I think feminist transformational leadership means that although we favor and want more women in the institutions, we don't want only more women. We want more women and a few men who really are feminist and transformational in their understanding of power and leadership. We could make a whole list of traits of what that means, but let me just start with a few that have been named not only by me, but by many others writing on this. I think the most important one is the idea of being collaborative rather than competitive. Now, I'm not sure you can eliminate all competition, but we can certainly work in a more collaborative methodology. And leadership is never, in my view, just the one person, but it's that person with others creating a different way of making something happen and thinking about it in an inclusive manner so that it is inclusive and it is intersectional in the sense that feminism has used that word of seeing how the things that happen to women intersect with other factors, race, class, etc., culture. And it looks at all issues in the world, not just women's issues. In some ways, we started with women's issues because those were the ones left off the agenda. We had to define the importance of violence against women. Violence against women is the war in the home. Violence against women is crucial, but we also, and reproductive rights, but we also have to see how climate and poverty and all the other issues are the intersection of gender with other factors. And so if we're ever going to build a truly universal human rights, it has to be one that is intersectional, that sees the connections, or in human rights terms, they call it indivisible, interconnected. These are what these terms have meant, and looks at all the issues and seeks to redress the dynamics of power and authority, creating accountability that keeps leaders responsible, but also recognizes that there are dynamics of power and authority, and that if we are going to not let that become our definition of leadership, we have to create institutions of accountability and ways of always asking ourselves to make sure we don't, what is our purpose and goals? Leadership for what? Why do we need women's leadership? We need feminist, transformational women's leadership to change the world, to move toward a more fair, just, inclusive world that sees people, men and women, on the margins and brings them to the center, and also provides a transformative vision of how we can collaborate. And it's very easy to get seduced by the power of being a leader. So we need to have reference groups as we send women into politics in the political sphere. They need reference groups of feminists, not just to hold them accountable, but to support them in the onslaught of patriarchy, telling them that those things can't happen and why they can't happen, and becoming realistic, etc. So we need support, not only for our activists, but for the women that go into institutions where that's possible. But finally, I think the biggest challenge today is where we started, which is the backlash against activists and defenders, where Bloom also started in defending the activists, the women who are trying to exercise transformative leadership, often in women's organizations. That's why we've developed, and I say we, the women's movement has really transformed the last 20 years, the idea of human rights defenders. We very consciously realized in 1998, I think, at the 50th anniversary of the UN, they had a declaration on human rights defenders. And we realized there was no recognition of the specific things that women experience. Defenders are not only defenders who challenge their government, but they're defenders. Feminist activists are often challenging their families. They're not always supported by their communities. They're challenging a much wider range than just government. And so the backlash has to be able to have methods of collective security where we can care for and hopefully meet the needs of women who are activists on the front line, either if that need is simply to get away. And I think in the former Yugoslavia, they had a house on an island in the that women could get to get rest. Other models have been giving women time away from the conflicts, or it may be, as I believe women in Central America have been doing in the work on defending human rights defenders there, finding collective security, safe houses, ways that women who are in need of that can get away, but most importantly, finding the resources for them to continue their work. And this is why we have now networks like Urgent Action Fund that are networks of women in all 4 continents now, hopefully 5 or 6 in the future, to be able to help provide that collective security and that caretaking as a movement. We can't just depend on friendly governments accepting people into their country for asylum, although that's a good tactic when it's appropriate. We have to build collective security where we are each other's defenders, where we are helping to find the resources for the needs that activists have in a time of backlash. I think that's, I had much more to say, but I really want to have a dialogue and hear your questions. And my notes tell me that I'm at that time. So I would like to just end there with the vision that women have been doing this for hundreds of years in different ways, and we should draw upon the strength of what that means for us as we take up our time, and as I pass my time to younger women to defend what we have gained. So with that, I'm going to ask who's taking the questions. I don't know, are you doing that, Brenda?
Thank you
Great.
so much, Charlotte. Let's just give you a round of applause. I would just like to ask everyone to please type their questions into the chat, and I'll keep the list and I'll moderate it. Before we have already some questions, and I'm going to ask the first question, and this comes from Homer. So the question is, how important is it for the UN to work in these challenging times when countries are not adhering to international laws and conventions?
Well, I think it's important for us to keep the UN in the picture. The UN is also in crisis because countries are, exactly as you said, not necessarily abiding by all the conventions they've signed. And certainly the conventions are not in themselves binding, as you know. But I think it's still an arena for us being able to say what should be happening and to get a counter pressure on our own governments. It's not only to abide by those declarations, but to get governments that at least believe in some of those things to be counter pressure on other governments. And this is very tricky because we know that the world is divided by North-South and religious conflicts. But I think it's like, if we want to make change, we have to work outside of government. And I think it helps to have been an activist on the ground before you think about doing work at the UN. I don't often say that's where a feminist activist should start. But I think if we think about local government, regional government, national government, and global governance, this is the only arena where we can use the governments who are in that arena and this bureaucracy that has arisen there to challenge governments, to put pressure on them. And particularly, one reason we wanted to make women's rights seen as human rights is the human rights system in the UN has a fairly elaborate set of mechanisms of special rapporteurs that can report on and put pressure on them. It never is enough by itself. I always say the UN is part of our mobilizing strategy. It's not our goal. The goal is a movement and a change that we want to see in the world. But the UN is one of the important arenas where we can advance that goal and where we can see each other and realize the things we might do across national or regional or religious or cultural boundaries. And so I see it both as a gathering place and as a tool for making change. But if it doesn't fit into our change at the local and national level, then it doesn't really work. But I do think that we need every arena we have. We need to be in every arena. We have to make those kinds of challenges. And the UN mechanisms, particularly the one on violence against women and on human rights defenders, are particularly important places for us to keep visible what it is that women are experiencing.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I have another question for you, and that question is: many women's organizations, particularly those with connections with Afghanistan and Iran, are advocating for the recognition of gender apartheid. But some believe that with many democratic countries undermining human rights principles as well as international law, this effort may be futile. How should we respond to these organizations?
Well, I think the movement for recognizing gender apartheid And also femicide, which is another term that has been used, it's not identical to gender apartheid, it's a different piece of the picture, are both important because these are terms that the world at least has a knowledge of what we're talking about. There's some traditional history around apartheid, which the mobilization around South Africa addressed. And I think calling for the recognition of gender apartheid in Iran or in Afghanistan in particular, I mean, the tragedy of the world playing around with Afghanistan is just really very, very tragic. And I think we owe women there at least a campaign to recognize what's now happening. And to me, gender apartheid is a good way to do that, is to bring that recognition. Of course, right now, we know that the governments of the world have decided not to intervene, but that can change. If you look at the history, there are moments that come and go. I remember when we were all first trying to talk about the Taliban in the 90s and building pressure about it. Of course, what happened is that women got used for a war that really wasn't about them. And that produced some useful changes, but it wasn't really about them. And so when that became no longer useful, women were abandoned. This is the world we live in. We are not yet in control, but our pressure and the use of those terms, in this case, gender apartheid, is building the pressure for future change. And you often never know when the breakthrough is going to happen. But if we keep it on the agenda and give it more powerful descriptions, I think that's worth doing, and we owe it to the women in Afghanistan who've been pawns in a world power struggle to do that.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. We have so many questions, so I'm going to ask them quickly. The next question is, what can we do to encourage the next generation of young women leaders?
Talk and listen.
Talk and listen. Excellent.
Especially listen, because sometimes we think we just have to talk. But I've learned from teaching for the last 20 years, 18, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that you have to listen because the same issues that we grew up defining and working on are happening to them, but in very different ways. And if we just talk, I should say listen and then talk. I think, and don't tell them what to do. Listen to how they see things and share what we have done, and what that might include is some ideas that would work for them, but they have to define ultimately how those strategies will work for them. But we can't expect them to know. The teaching of our feminist history has not been as effective as it should be. So we cannot expect young women to know this history. So yes, that's where we have to talk. We have to tell our stories. We have to offer that. But it has to be in a way that recognizes their agency. They have to be the leaders of their agency. We should support their agency. We should give them ideas. We should share our history. But maybe it is listen and talk. Listen and then talk.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Khalid Masood. Hi, Khalid. Nice to see you here. The question is, well, he thanks you for your argument for women's leadership. And he says, it is right that culture is not an excuse, but culture is a real problem. How to transform cultures to respond positively to women's leadership? So that's the question. How to transform cultures to respond positively to women's leadership?
I think that's probably another 5-hour discussion. But let me just say that I think the culture is definitely a problem. That's why I mentioned it. And I think it varies a little bit from country to country how we do that, the first thing I have to do in the US is convince people that we have culture and that the culture we have is also patriarchal and also has many contemporary forms of silencing and abusing women. In every country, I think there has to be some ability to talk about the fact that culture does shape the forms of these issues that we experience, but they are not unique to our cultures. And so it's that balance of the commonality and the diversity that we have to achieve. And of course, we have to make women feel that it's not an agenda from somewhere else. And that's really hard. I understand that's hard because the media and the world is trying to separate us and is always giving, not all media, of course, but giving messages that make it hard to see what we have in common. So I think the personal is political. It usually is more possible to change the attitudes of women by starting with really talking about what they experience personally, where culture is in that, and then beginning to think how could it be different. But it is a slow process. I think my culture has changed enormously, but it's still not over.
So just a follow-up question to that, Charlotte, is from Yakin, and she's asking, and she asked Khalid, whose culture and who's defining culture? And I think that's a perennial problem in terms of women's agency and representation and interpretation. So
absolutely, and everyone should read Yakin's reports as a special rapporteur on violence against women, where she takes up the question of culture. I use that in every one of my classes, and you don't have your face on here, Yakin, but I thank you for those reports because I think they really give us tools for discussing where does culture come from, who is defining it, absolutely, whose culture. Usually it's all essentially male dominant racial groups' culture and history that's being defined. And I think they then tell us not to accept things from other cultures as a way to make us think that somehow they've been part of defining that as if it were theirs. It's such a complicated question because it is the most effective way to hold women back, I think, from what they might feel about changes that need to be made, to be told them that they are betraying their group, especially if it's a minority group in a country or a country that feels that it is powerless versus the big powers. It is also, as you have said so well in your reports, the ways in which we are kept from feeling that we have agency to determine what our culture should be. No culture is static. That anybody's history will show cultural change over time. And for women to really believe that we can also be the ones defining and changing that culture is so important. So absolutely. Thank you, Yakin, and thank you for those amazing reports. I know they're available in some of your books, and the organizers can make sure everybody knows how to find them. Thank you.
Yakin, would you like to have 2 minutes to make a response? I'll just ask, I'll unmute you.
2 minutes is hardly worth speaking. So I just want to say hello to everybody. This is amazing. And I think we need to do more of this at these troubled times, because it is through these moments that we renew our beliefs and convictions and the search for greater solidarity. And one issue that hasn't come up and that I'm very much involved in these days is the whole issue of care crisis and its implications for gender equality, and how we need to go back to the 70s when care was a major concern for the feminists. And then we sort of forgot about it because we started mainstreaming gender, which I never understood why. So we have a long way to go. It's a never-ending story. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And Charlotte, as always, pleasure listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll go back to the questions. We have a question from, I'm going through, I have a very long list of questions, sorry. This is a question from Amanda. What do you think the responsibility of a country's education system is in teaching young people transformational leadership skills? And how can we engage with schools on this topic?
I think that's a wonderful question. Of course, the responsibility of the education system should be providing ideas about transformational leadership. So it depends on your governance and who controls your education system, how much you can get that. But I do think that women's studies and gender aware courses, I mean, why is Hungary banning gender and women's studies? Why have they thrown out those courses in so many parts of the world? I hear this in Peru too, where the slogan has been, you know, basically, don't touch my children. For teachers to be told, don't touch my, and I don't mean touch like this, I mean, don't try to influence my children. This is really important that we understand the role of education, that place where young students should get a chance to think about how gender is constructed and what's possible to change. This is where the mainstreaming, I think, means something if it can happen. But of course, it's not just telling education systems who don't believe in it to check off these 5 lists, which is what some of the mainstreaming from the UN has become, or from governments. I think we have to have alternative schools, even if it's after school. We have to have alternative places that children get ideas, but you have to believe in that. It isn't just a road. So changing education is a good way to keep moving the new political ideas, but we don't control the educational institutions. So we have to move what we can into them and keep providing other places. I mean, I remember many years ago when the Black Panthers were a major political force in the US. What did they do? They did breakfast programs for children where they got a chance to give them food because they were malnourished and to teach them new ideas. You know, we have to create places outside of the institutions we don't control, as well as create spaces like I hope gender studies has been, where it has been able to infiltrate and be taught at different levels. But it is a very important thing. We need to figure out how to do more of it, because otherwise we're trying to do the transformation when people are 25 years old instead of getting some possibility of thinking differently as they're younger.
Thank you very much. I have another question. Please give me a minute as I'm navigating the question. The question is from Farida Mayberg. How do feminist leaders navigate the erosion of institutions that once supported gender equality?
Well, it depends on which institutions you're thinking of, particularly Farida. I mean, we have to be agile, and we, I think, have to, in this particular moment, find better ways to support our institutions so that we're not so dependent on funders. There are funders who support gender equality, but particularly in Europe, where those funders are tied to governments, when the Dutch government and the Swedish government became more conservative, vast amounts of money have been taken away from feminist organizations who counted on that money. We have to find ways to be a bit more agile the way early movements were, which were not as dependent on funders. But I'm not saying that we give up on trying to get money from funders. We still need resources, but we need to think of other ways of working, to remember ways of working of movements that don't have funders, So that would be one institution that supports women's rights at different times and places, but it's not something you can always count on. I don't know if there are other institutions you were thinking of, but it kind of reminds me, and I think goes to Joaquin's point about gender mainstreaming. We can't do one of these things only. You know, if all our strategy is gender mainstreaming, we will not get there. We have to be building a movement that changes the agenda in order to be able to do gender mainstreaming as one of its things. But we can't be only doing that, because the ideas have to be generated and supported by an independent, autonomous, feminist movement that doesn't entirely depend on governments or funders, or I don't know which institutions you had in mind you want to say, but it's a both and strategy. We should get all the resources we can, but we have to be able to move when those resources are not available. We have to find ways not to become so dependent on them that we can't move on the ground.
Thank you, Charlotte. I have a lot more questions, so I'm just going through them. The next question is about, you mentioned the need for a more intersectional and collaborative approach across movements. So this is from Aisha Shahid, and she asks that she agrees that we need to be more strategic about linking up with other groups, but how do we ensure that a feminist perspective doesn't get lost in that mix, say, between climate change and peace, security, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I should. That was a great question. I don't know where you are, but I appreciate that question, because as we try to make alliances, we do have to keep clarity about who we are and what is our core point. And I think that particularly in something like the climate crisis, which is so important today, one of the challenges is exactly that. It's not only women as the ones who have suffered the most from many of the climate crises and are always cleaning up the mess. It also has to be how women keep their agency and have more power to determine that these crises are addressed, and are addressed in a gender sensitive way that doesn't just assume, again, as somebody said, every time, and I feel this a little bit, every time, a city or a country becomes ungovernable in the US, then we allow people of color or women to be in charge. And, I think that's somewhat happening to Kamala Harris. She will need a lot of support to deal with the mess, and it happens at local levels and so forth. So you're absolutely right. We can't stop. The only way I can say, how can we do it? I think one of the most important strategies women have had is to have a feminist reference group or a women's caucus, to have a group of people who you are doing this with while you're trying to affect and make alliance with the climate change or any other movement, to continue to have spaces that are defined by your feminist advocacy, in which you make strategy and continually reflect on how do we keep our agenda there. Because women have been told since the time I began organizing, and that's 50 years, and I'm sure it's many more than that, are always told there's a larger issue, there's a bigger issue. We'll get to that later. We've learned there is no later. If we aren't also talking about it now, we won't get there later. So we have to talk about the climate crisis. It's very urgent, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't just say, oh, once we solve the climate crisis, then we'll do that, because we know that doesn't happen. That was supposed to happen with socialism. We got, socialism, then we could deal with women. I think there were some good things that did happen for women under socialism, but it didn't solve all the issues. So absolutely, we have to work both and. We have to keep our feminist space and conversations and give each other critical but positive feedback on how to do it. Because sometimes I think the dialogue amongst feminists becomes either get in or get out. You know, it's kind of not allowing for the both and strategies that I personally think we have to have. I've always, well, not always, I had a brief period of lesbian separatism that many of you know, but I've most of my life felt that working across lines is important. Trusting that we have different things that need to be done. I've worked a lot with women who are maybe not as radical as I think I am, and probably with women who think I'm not radical enough. And it's important to keep those lines of conversation. Not that we can't critique each other, but as much as possible to understand we're in the same movement with different ideas about how to get there. And so I think reference groups, caucuses, I did a lot of my early feminism in caucuses within anti-war groups, women's caucuses in the anti-war movement in the US were a big part of early feminist activity. And so I think that's the general answer. Each one is specific. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you, Charlotte. So we have time for one last question, and I'm going to take Yakin's question. And she said that Charlotte's concept of collective security sounds fascinating. Could you elaborate, please, Charlotte?
Well, first I would just say that there are several things on collective security that have been produced by both Urgent Action Fund in the different regions and also by the Central American, Mexican, I can't get the name right now, Defensores organization based in Mexico that Lydia Alpizar, who many of you know, I'll find the exact address and contact and send it. But they have been working with how to work first. The first line of defense is to have women who will themselves understand what other women need, who can move someone from place to place, who can also they also have funding for emergency situations. And they start from the assumption that it isn't just an individual, because the human rights defender world has tended to talk about, you know, one brave individual, one journalist. So they're trying to give a feminist context that the only security for women, particularly because often it's your own community, not just the government that's challenging you, requires the collective group providing that security and having resources to help women ourselves. And this is much of the thinking behind the Urgent Action Fund work also. And I would be happy to post or send to Homa information she can post for people about some of the publications that are being produced. But to me, it is, in a way, that part of the answer to what you were saying, which is not to become dependent on the mainstream. How do we actually do as much as possible to protect each other first? And then we can ask for resources from outside, or someone needs to go somewhere. You ask, but it's a collective asking, not just a individual defender who's a hero that you need to rescue. But it's a way of trying to work with more feminist principles for doing that. So there are houses that are they're basically safe houses, but they're not known by others. They're women who are willing to take somebody across a border or to send a woman within the Central American region to a place she needs to go for a while, etc. Or to come to her house so that she's never alone if anything happens, things like that. It's really not so much the drama of it as it is the thinking about how do we do this for each other when someone's in trouble. And it's a very important move. It's also part of a move for collective care, which is also recognizing that sometimes what's needed is just to get the person out of the country in a place where you know they will have safety and a chance to recuperate. And that's something feminists have done in relation to domestic violence and conflict and war for many years. But I think we need to be thinking about that as collective care. It isn't just, and you're absolutely right, the care agenda is so important because women have been both the caregivers, but very rarely thought of as the ones who need care. And yet we are also needing to care for each other, as well as deal with what happens when the society doesn't provide the care. It's always women who pick up the load. So the care agenda is definitely, I wish we had more time for you to talk about that, but I think it's also a concept that women have brought to the forefront right now. And maybe you can post something we should all read about that work, right?
Thanks very much, Charlotte. I want everyone to just have a big thank you and appreciation for Charlotte. And I'm going to pass to Homa to give the vote of thanks. Homa, if you could unmute, please.
Wow. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and everybody for a fascinating talk. It has brought so many memories also for me, because I've been part of some of the debates and fights and tears, cries that we have had. So it's been wonderful to listen to you and wonderful questions and debates. And I hope we can continue this debates, because this is the time we need to discuss these things more collectively rather than individually. And I hope we can organize many more of these platforms, as much as Zoom is not the ideal, but is what is possible now. Right. And I want to thank, and especially also I want to thank Mona for working behind the scene, trying to organize some of the issues to discuss about running the institute. And Charlotte, we probably will come back to you again with question about launching the institute next month. And so anyway, thank you very much for all the participants. I see so many names I know, and I'm very grateful for everyone who came and stayed and was part of the discussion and the questions. And we will hopefully get back to you with more of these sessions. And also, if you organize the session, let us know so we can join you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for always being on the forefront of pushing us to think about these things. Homa and Bloom in general, and Women's Learning Partnership as another sponsor. I thank you all that, we get more of these opportunities, because we can't be flying around the world as much for climate reasons, as well as some of us with aging joints. So these Zoom conversations are really important. Thank you so much, all of you.
So, if Mona, can you unmute yourself and just thank our co-sponsors, because people were so interested to have this meeting as well.
Yes, Charlotte, you're extremely popular, that we had multiple entities, feminist entities from across the world, but particularly from the Muslim world, who very generously supported us in this. Of course, we've already put it in the chat, all the various, I think it was a total of 6 feminist entities that worked with us. So I wanted to thank every single one for supporting us, because this is really the moment for solidarity. This is really the moment for us to come together, for building bridges, creating those spaces for exchange of knowledge and exchange of experiences. And we are very, very thankful to have such a major figures to be able to follow in the footsteps of. So, so thank you for everyone joining us, and thank you for everyone, for Charlotte in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to end the meeting for everyone, but I'll request Leila, Mona, Homa, and Charlotte just to stay on for 1 minute of just a wrap up privately. And Alejandra, of course.
Thank you.